Today is more talking about tools for developing devotion, and I'm going to start by touching on some overall understandings and approaches that will help with that. And one of them is that we're working with feeling, and emotional feeling sometimes comes up, devotional feeling, and they're very closely related because we're working with trying to awaken the energy at the heart chakra. And you will see that when you start awakening that energy, sometimes it, rather than going up to devotion, it goes out into emotion. And I've seen this with people. You'll see people who are very devotionally inclined can sometimes also be very emotional when something comes up. And I think there's a tendency for yogis, and men especially, to be afraid of this expression of emotion. And so rather than trying to transmute it into devotion, there's a tendency to try to suppress overall the feelings of the heart. And so I think people are sometimes a little afraid of awakening that feeling because this lifetime, last lifetime, we've experienced the up and downs of being, quote, emotional. And this got brought up just Thursday. Someone who came to last week's class told me that they were really working on developing devotion this week. And suddenly they just had this big angry outburst where they shouted at their husband. And it was really unusual for them. And they said, "What's happening? Why did this happen?" And just, here I am trying to develop devotion and this happens. And I think they were seeing it as sort of the opposite of devotion. But in a way, it's just the same energy. It's the energy of the heart, energizing the heart chakra. And as we energize it, sometimes when we do lose control of that energy, and it does go out, it's going to go out with a lot more strength. And Swami Kriyanandaji talked about this. He said that as people develop spiritually with Kriya Yoga, other things, and increase the flow of energy in the astral spine, that the tendencies that they have for the energy to go out through the chakras are actually highlighted and energized and intensified. And he said this is why you'll see very advanced people, yogis, express really strong faults, stronger sometimes as they develop. And it's simply because there's more energy there. He applied it to Kriya Yoga in the sense that Kriya Yoga increases the flow of energy in the astral spine. And he said in the beginning, it's hard to control. He said it's a little bit like riding a horse. When you come away from the stable with the horse, and all of a sudden this horse starts getting really energetic and starts running really fast and out of control because you're not used to controlling an energetic horse. And he said rather than, or he alluded to this, rather than trying to squelch the energy of the horse, learn to control the energy of the horse, because it's a lot more enjoyable to ride an energetic horse with a lot of strength, with control, than just a lazy horse that just is easier to control and just kind of poking along. And so when we're working with feeling and the energy of the heart chakra, these things will happen. And you'll see that, sometimes you'll get more emotional at times or sentimental. And, the downside, and again, I'll talk about what I saw with Swami Kriyanandaji. I saw him just very expressive of the energies of his heart. And it could come in, some people I think would say it was emotional, but I could see him, crying at a scene in a movie that was just very, for him, uplifting and awaken those feelings of the heart. And I think some people would just say, "Oh, that's just emotional, and I don't want to be emotional." But he didn't indulge in those feelings, and I think that's the difference. I think you also see people who are very emotional, who indulge in being emotional because they enjoy the ups and downs of the emotions. They enjoy the intense positive emotions, and they'll get upset with someone and have a big fight, and then they'll have an emotional making up with the person, and just they enjoy that intensity of expression of emotions. But after a while you realize it's just a roller coaster ride. And so sometimes people will tend to suppress the energy itself rather than trying to redirect it. And so very simply, the yogis, Swamiji has described the difference between emotion and devotion. Emotion is the energy going down the astral spine and outward through the heart chakra into engagement and involvement with the world, anger, emotion, all these things. Devotion is simply reversing that flow of energy in and offering it up to God. And so you'll find it helpful when emotion comes up, and even when it expressed strongly and outwardly and perhaps negatively, try to impersonalize it to an extent. Yeah, you have to deal with the repercussions of if you hurt someone or this or that, but try to deal with it, the energy itself, more impersonally, and just recognize, rather than feeling really bad about yourself, oh, I really messed up and I screwed up and did this and that, just say, okay, the energy is being awakened. I lost control of it. I'm glad God helped me to see, obviously, that I don't have control. And my part is to reverse it and offer it up devotionally to God. Because having that energy is a good thing. I think it's better to have emotional out of control energy than to have a heart that's been repressed and stuffed, which people very often tend to do. So in the end, it's all about redirecting it upwards towards God. And that's why a lot of practices and tools are very, very good. Because any time that we can use a tool that reminds us of God, on some level it does, in fact, change the flow of direction of that energy. I sometimes say that devotion or devotional chanting is actually a technique of yoga, and we don't think of it that way. It sounds like it's sort of belittling it to call it a yoga technique, but in fact it is, because of the effect that it has. Devotional chanting, if done right, takes that flow of energy in and redirects it upwards. Now, you also see people indulge in emotional chanting and just jumping up and down. And Yoganandaji made fun of this sect in Christianity in America. They're called holy rollers because they get inspired, so they call it, by the Holy Ghost. And they start shouting in tongues, speaking in tongues, just weird languages and nonsense, and they start rolling around on the floor, and as they see it, inspired by God. And Yoganandaji said that they're really inspired by the Holy Ghost of emotion. And again, it's just simply the energy going down and out, even in an expression supposedly of devotion. So just be aware that it's a flow of energy, it's an awakening of energy, and it's a redirecting of energy. And the techniques of Kriya Yoga are really, really helpful, especially Kriya Hangsa, because we have to do two things with that feeling energy. One, we have to calm the waves, because when we get emotional, it's not just that the energy is going down and out, it's also that the waves are starting to get disturbed. And so yoga's chitta vritti narod, which is calming those waves, a feeling of the heart. And then when they're calmer, then it's a lot easier to control and redirect and be more aware of what's happening. Because you'll see that when you get emotional and have an outburst, you've lost awareness of what's going on. Because if you were aware, you certainly wouldn't have done, and you say this, boy, how did I possibly do that and say that to that person? Because you weren't aware in the moment. And so yoga, meditation gives us the calmness of those waves of feeling and pranayama, or control of that. So again, it's something that we all have, which is this heart energy. It's been, as I said last week, it's been beat out of us, it's been suppressed, it's been knocked, it's been pushed down. And our part is simply to tune into it and be aware of it and reawaken it. There's one, it's sort of a tool, but it's also just an awareness that I have found really helpful. Swamiji, especially in the early years of Ananda, but over the years and in a couple of his books, he quoted a Catholic saint who said, "If you knew how much God loved you, you would die of joy." And to me, that's one of the greatest statements that there is. And the way I liken it, it's almost like this saint hacked the programming code for finding God, because that statement is just, it's an if-then programming statement. Many programming statements for computer code are, if you push the A key on the keyboard, then an A will show up. And so this saint got into the programming and said, if you knew how much God loved you, you would die of joy. And I find it very helpful to meditate on that, to meditate on how much does God love all of us, not me, but all of his children or her children, and just really meditate and tune into that. Because basically he's saying if you understood that, you would go into samadhi. That's what he meant. You would die of joy. It's an interesting statement because a few years ago I looked up online. I tried to find the exact quote by this saint. And I also wanted to see the context of it. And this is a little bit of an aside. And I just couldn't find it anywhere. All I could find was a revision of that quote that said, if you go to church on Sunday, you would die of joy. And that's essentially what it said. I said, that can't be right. And finally I found, through the great Google Samhita, which is the repository of all knowledge everywhere, I found an 1860, I think it was, book that was a biography of this saint. And this was the very first translation from French into English, just 2 years after he left the body. And this is the quote. It's just beautiful, and I wanted to read it. Did we but know how our Lord loves us, we should die of joy. Our only happiness on earth is to love God and to know that God loves us. To be loved by God, to be united to God, to live in the presence of God, to live for God. O blessed life and blessed death. And then, hearing the birds singing in the window, this saint said, poor little birds, you were created to sing, and you sing. Man was created to love God, and he loves him not. And so he's saying that this really is the purpose of our existence, our creation, is very simply is to love God. And so the more that we're aware of that, and the more that we develop that and awaken that, the happier we'll be. And in the end, it's the only way to find happiness. Now, it also implies in this statement that this is for everyone. It's not, God gave us that power to love. And so that power is equally in everybody. And so these tools that we use to develop that devotion are something that we can work on every single day. One of them, another one that I have found very helpful, is an analogy that Master often used. And he was in the theater, as we know, watching this movie and watching just this horrible bloodshed on the battlefield being shown in the newsreels. And he was getting caught up in the emotion of it. And then he noticed that there was this beam of light projecting it onto the screen, and he followed the light back, and there was a projector and a projection booth showing the light on the screen. And he realized that this was really how this whole creation is just, he said, the way he said it is really amazing. He said, all of this creation, everything that we see, is no more real than a movie. And that's an amazing statement. He didn't say it's kind of like a movie, it's sort of like a movie, a movie's a good analogy. He said it's no more real than a movie. And the way out is to follow the beam and to look back to the one who's projecting it and who created it, which is just simply to think of God, or to look up to the spiritual eye is our way of looking back up that beam. And so the more that we can do to any God-reminding thought, action, activity, starts to dissolve that screen of duality and helps us to really fulfill what we were made to do. Now, one helpful way to do that is to make it a game every day. Just if you go through life looking for anything constantly, you'll eventually find it. Just the thought of anything held in the mind really, really strongly. Eventually, if you start looking hard enough, listening sensitively enough, you'll hear God speaking to you. You'll see God in the eyes of people. You'll see God everywhere in all of creation. Our part is just to look for it. And so that's one way, one tool for developing that is just very consciously try to see God everywhere. I have had this practice for many years. I've always enjoyed God in nature. It's been very easy and natural for me. My first experiences of God were often in very natural environments. And then I came to Ananda village, and there was all of a sudden I was in a community with a lot of people, And now I'm in a city where there's very little nature and a whole lot of people. And over the years, I've just found it as a conscious practice to try to see God in people all the time. And if you do a practice like this a lot, consistently, try to make it a daily routine, you'll find that it starts to become natural and easy. And for me, walking through a city street with all kinds of people walking everywhere, I just really at times enjoy I guess someone would call it people watching, but for me it's God watching, or God in people watching. And just all these little ways of just trying to take our mind away from getting caught up in the outer reality and turning it towards God. And just many, many ways of doing this. Do as many as you can. And that's one that I think you may find very helpful, but there are many others. And what I'm going to do is probably maybe later today, I'll list the different possible practices that we can do. And I'll send it to Aditya, and he can email it to people as ways of just tools and practices that we can do, sort of homework assignment. Now, the main practices that we can do, because all of us are here living in the world, and this is the work that our gurus gave to us. It was not to go hide away in the caves, where it seems easier at times. I think probably everyone in this room thinks at times in the middle of their intense activities, just the thought comes up, oh gosh, I wish I could just go to a cave in the mountains and just be so simple and easy. And in fact, it isn't really. I think Master put us here because it's going to be quicker to find God exactly where we've been put. And Master, when he went into the Himalayas to try to escape the ashram duties that his strict guru, Sri Yukteswarji, was giving to him to do, he said when he went up to the Himalayas to find God, all he found was sadhus arguing and fighting over food and blankets, and delusion was just as much there as anywhere. And trust that God has put us exactly where he wants us to find freedom. And in fact, not where he wants us, but I think where he ideally knows that it's the best setup for finding freedom. So just trust in that. Now, a lot of the practices that we can do are moment to moment. They're not this big, grandiose, huge effort of going into seclusion for 2 weeks and just making this superhuman effort to do meditation for 12 hours a day and a lot of kriya, and that's how we're going to get suddenly, quickly liberated. It's really in the day-to-day moments of our lives, wherever we are. The way that Yoganandaji put it, he said that the minutes are more important than the years. And he was talking about making this minute-to-minute effort to have a spiritual practice, not just doing 45 minutes of meditation in the morning and then getting up and doing our worldly stuff and then getting back and doing our God stuff at the end of the day, but making it all one seamless practice. So a lot of these tools are designed to do this. The way Ananda Ma put it, she said that he should be present in all your actions. Remember, time is always running out. And I just find that helpful to remember. Time is always running out. I had a strange experience. I don't think I've ever shared this, where I was going through a real test in my life. And I heard that people have this practice when they have a really deep spiritual question, that they pray to Master and they open the autobiography of a yogi. And whatever their eyes first set on, they take as Master's advice. And you see this in the West. People do that with the Bible. And I'd never done this before. I've never done it since either, as you'll see when I explain what happened. But I opened the book, and I was in an intense, Master, I need your help desperately. The very first words, you shall soon be dead. I didn't even know those words were in there. And of course, it's Master speaking to that boy Kashi, and he wasn't talking about dead in spirit or Mahasamadhi. He said, physically, you shall soon be dead. I thought, okay. And my first reaction was, okay, maybe I opened it up in the right place, but my eyes didn't go to the right sentence. And since this is the beginning of one chapter on the right side, which is where those words were, I'll look on the left side, which is the end of the previous chapter. It'll be a whole different subject than "You shall soon be dead." And the very first words there were about Lahiri Mahashai's Mahasamadhi when he left the body. And I thought, okay, maybe this is what Master is trying to tell me. And what does soon mean? Well, I think we're all going to soon be dead, whether it's 10 years or 50 years or I mean, that's a very short amount of time. And this was probably about 15 years ago. So, maybe it's still soon in another 20 years, who knows? But when I read that, I thought, okay, I'll soon be dead. How should I live my life? And I think we've all asked that question. You hear this rhetorical question. If you found out that tomorrow you were going to die, what would you do in the next 24 hours? And so I began thinking that way. And at that point, I decided I'll do more Kriya Yoga. I'll give more of my thought and devotion to God. And I'll live with a sense of freedom, devotion, and love the best that I can, but also with the sense that the minutes are more important than the years, and that trying to make all these moments God reminding. So also for a greedy reason, I wasn't thinking this way, but so that if suddenly I die tomorrow, if you have your thoughts on God all the time, then when you leave the body, as Krishna said, the thoughts that you have and the consciousness you have when you leave the body, that will determine your next life, or not, if you don't have to reincarnate. I had a friend who heard about Mahatma Gandhiji chanting Sri Ram, Jai Ram as he was assassinated and falling to the ground and leaving the body. And my friend said, boy, I hope I have the presence of mind to suddenly turn to God when I leave the body like that. But in fact, Gandhiji wasn't that he had presence of mind. He was always chanting Sri Ram, Jai Ram. And so if we can do that as a regular daily practice, japa especially, chanting the name of God, and at times, and I'll talk about this more, just more having the awareness of God's presence, not necessarily just chanting, but having God contact Divine Mother, the Guru, just with us in our heart and in our awareness at all times. This is where the minutes are more important than the years. And this is where you will find yourself really, really changing. I think more than just doing Kriya Yoga, getting up and forgetting God and then coming back at the end of the day, remembering God again. It's really in these moment times. There's different ways, and I'll talk about chanting japa and doing that, which is one that Swami Kriyanandaji often recommended, and he recommended to me personally, because people want a mantra and something to chant. And he recommended very often just to mentally chant Om Guru, Om Guru, Om Guru. And I believe Yoganandaji recommended it to his disciples to chant Om Guru as a japa, as mantra. And when Swamiji recommended this to me, he said that if you do this, you will feel more joy, you will feel more inspiration, you will feel a greater desire for God. And to me, that was the selling point for me. You will feel a greater desire for God, because that intensity of that desire in the end is really everything. If we can keep that intensity of that desire going, that's sort of the coin that's going to buy us. And I hate to sort of trivialize it like that, but that's what's going to get us God freedom. We know this story of this boy who went to the Guru and asked him to be his disciple, and the Guru took him and said, well, let's see if you're ready to be a disciple. And so they went to this pool of water, and the Guru suddenly took the boy's head by the back of the neck and crammed his face under the water and held it underwater for a really, really long time. This must have been an enlightened master, because he didn't end up drowning the boy, because he easily could have. And finally the boy was thrashing and pulling and trying to get out, and finally the Guru pulled his head up, and the boy started coughing and gasping for air, and the Guru asked him, what did you want more than anything else at that moment? And the boy just said, air, air, and he was coughing and gasping, and the Guru said, when you want God that intensely, come back to me. That's what it takes to find God. On one level, that thought can be daunting, because we all say, well, gosh, I have all these other desires and I'm not ready for that. But the other side of it is that we can develop that. And the more and more we develop that intensity and craving, the quicker we will get out. And this is what Swamiji was saying, is that when we practice japa, it just starts to turn the heart, and starts to cultivate and develop devotion. And to answer your question, yes, we can develop and cultivate and awaken devotion through our conscious actions, our minds, our hearts. In the end, it's not us really doing it. Swamiji, and this is just a reminder, but Swamiji said that when we practice Kriya Yoga, every Kriya should be an act of devotional self-offering. And then he said the reason being that when we offer ourselves to God with devotion, then God's grace is able to enter us, change us, and lift us to freedom. And so it's not our heroic actions that do it, it's our part, which is to offer ourselves in thought, in desire, in action, into God's light, into God's love. And when we do that repeatedly, over and over again, God's grace comes. I shared this last night at a webinar we had, but it's a little bit like churning butter. And I used to, in an earlier incarnation at Ananda, I milked cows every day and made butter and cheese and all kinds of things. And I churned butter a lot. And at one point we just started using an electric blender for churning it, but you can churn it by hand. And when you churn butter by hand, you're not always sure how long it's going to take, because sometimes, just depending on what the cow was eating, fresh grass or grain, what time of year, the temperature of the cream, it just takes longer or shorter. And our part with churning the butter was not to start doubting if the butter was going to ever be made. Our part was simply just to churn, never ending, keep going, that inevitably the butter will come out. And it'll start getting harder, and you'll start getting clumping together, and eventually it becomes butter and the water goes away. And our part with practicing these tools is very simply, it's like churning butter. We don't know when it's going to happen. It can take a long time. It can take decades. It can take a whole lifetime. But very simply, our part is just to keep churning. And this churning is japa in a way, practicing the presence of God, all these things are churning the heart to start cultivating, awakening, developing devotion. And Master often talked about it as cultivating devotion. And as a gardener, I know that when you cultivate soil, you get all the weeds out, you loosen the soil, and you basically fertilize it, you water it, you feed it. And it's the same way. You just make the heart ready in as many ways as you can by staying away as much as you can from worldly influences that pull you down, by being in satsang as much as you can, because the power of magnetism is really, really strong. Yoganandaji said environment is stronger than willpower. And especially with this practice, one disciple asked Yoganandaji, he was very emotional, and he said, how can I become devotional? And Master's answer was simple. He didn't give him techniques. He didn't give him practices except one. He said, start spending more time with devotional people. It was as simple as that. And so start spending more time in satsang, and you will find that magnetism, the way Master put it another time, he says that a piece of charcoal does not become red by itself. It needs to be close to other red-hot charcoals, and then that influence starts awakening the fire, with the innate ability of that non-red charcoal to start catching fire and becoming awake. And so satsang is really extremely important. I'm going to talk about another practice that I think you'll find very, very helpful. I think in some ways I have found this the most helpful of anything I've ever done, which is, it sounds strange to put it this way, but it's developing and making devotion a habit. And we think of habits as mechanical things that we do. But in fact, habits are not just actions. They're actually more on the level of mind and feeling. And the way Master described habits, he says there's a groove in the brain that's been created by doing the same thought and same action repeatedly over and over and over again. And so the energy just tends to go down that groove. It starts going down that groove, and just it's hard to trip it up and divert it to something positive if it's a bad habit. I had an experience of this a few years ago. I lived at Ananda Village, and I lived in the same house there for about 17 years. And then about 5 years ago, I moved to a different house that was on a completely different part of the Ananda property, just like 2 miles apart. I mean, it was just very, very far away, different route and everything. And somewhere about 6 months later, I was at the Sunday satsang at Ananda Village, and I was driving home, and I was just thinking, probably absent-mindedly, of the satsang and what was going on, and I wasn't paying attention. And suddenly I found myself driving into the driveway of my old place that I had moved away from 6 months ago. It was like, I woke up and it was like, how did this happen? And it was simply that the energy had been going in that direction for 17 years, on that same road, that same route. And because I was in sort of a passive mode, and this is a good lesson, when we're passive, the energy tends to go in those old patterns and old directions. And this was a really old pattern. And just think of all the old patterns that we have. But again, the key was that in this case, I was kind of spacing out and just being a little passive in my consciousness. And so when we're energetic and more conscious and making a conscious attempt to tune into God, then the energy will not tend to go in these old ways of desire, attachment, anger. And so this is one really good reason for developing devotion as a habit. But eventually what happens is that it starts really to become a habit where our mind, and I've seen this really dramatically, the mind more and more turns to God in all situations at any time. And the ways that I've worked on it, and this is going to be your homework assignment, the main one, I think, or one of them, is to start finding times during the day where, or not just times, but situations where you can start changing the habit of the mind, either spacing out or just getting outward, or getting caught up in irritation at a particular person who pushes our buttons all the time and irritates us. And very, very consciously realizing that those situations and times, they're habits that have, over time, we've allowed our energy to go in those directions. And we can use those times as triggers to turn our mind to God. And I'll talk about some ways that I've used this. One of them is that I started playing a game that when I woke up in the morning or in the middle of the night, I would see how quickly I could turn my mind to God. Because I found myself, stumbling out of bed, brushing my teeth, and finally after 10 minutes waking up and realizing, oh, God and Guru, I'm about to meditate, and don't wait for the meditation room to start thinking of God. And so I just made it a game, how quickly my mind would go to God or Guru as soon as I woke up. And you can really change this in dramatic ways, from hours to minutes to really, really quickly. And even in the middle of the night, if you wake up in the middle of the night, just the mind going very directly to God or the Guru. And it's a really, really fun practice, because it's sort of a game in a way. It's God playing hide and seek with us, and we can see how, and it's not a game where we can ever lose, because it's not like you punish yourself for, oh God, it was 10 minutes today, I was really terrible, I lost today. It's a fun game, and just have fun with it. And you'll find that it's really very, very, very effective and extremely helpful. The other thing is other habits during the day. And so when you brush your teeth, what do we do usually when we brush our teeth? We're just kind of thinking about the day and I don't want to go to work today or whatever. And brush your teeth with God and start looking in the mirror and talking to God and sharing your thoughts with God. The other time, and I saw Swami Kriyanandaji do this, I see so few Ananda people do this that I'm always surprised, is that whenever he got in a car to go somewhere, he would always stop and pray for 30 seconds, a minute, always. And so turning the key in the car, see that as a moment to always think of God. And you can start to do that, where it just becomes automatic. And if you do enough of these kinds of things during the day, throughout the day, you start to see that you just start thinking of God more and more and more. It becomes a habit, and not a mechanical habit at all, because no thought of God can be mechanical. But we just forget. It's a way of tricking delusion, because just delusion is always trying to get us to go outside of ourselves, to worry about stuff, to have our minds going anywhere but God. It's the whole point of delusion. And so we become habituated to going into that mode. And basically the groove caused by the energy always going out towards those thoughts and restless thoughts, etc., is very strong. And so we have to consciously try to change that pattern. And so that's another one. Another one is working with attitudes. And an attitude, especially negative, well, all attitudes, but negative reactions to things is a habit also. And if a person, there's, probably someone in every family or neighbor or where you work who just irritates us. And they just get under our skin, and their voice just rubs us the wrong way, or they say things that just maybe are mean. And we tend over time to start reacting emotionally or negatively. This is called, someone who pushes your buttons. One of the things that I found is that if there's someone who pushes your buttons, the problem isn't theirs. The problem is ours, because we have buttons that can be pushed. So if we get rid of the buttons, which is this reactive tendency in us, then nobody has any buttons on us to push. And one of the ways to do this is when there's a situation or a person, and a situation could be driving in traffic. And driving in traffic, and this person is rude and aggressive and cuts us off. How do we react? Most people react with either anger or irritation, or why did that person do that? And you get a little upset. And you can consciously make the choice that from now on, when someone cuts me off, I'm going to joyfully bless them and turn my mind to God and Guru. And yeah, you'll slip up, you'll start to slip up, but you'll find that the first few times maybe the person does it and you get upset and you think, oh, that's right, I was supposed to think of God in that moment. And you can really change these things over time and choose some of these things, and choose a difficult one and choose an easy one. An easy one is brushing your teeth or starting the car. It's just a very simple act. It's neutral in the sense that there's no reactive process involved. And choose a hard one, which the hard one being a particular person who upsets us, or a particular tendency that we have towards anger or upset in certain situations that happen every day. And so the homework assignment, again, we'll email this out, is just to start developing God-reminding habits. This, in a way, is practicing the presence of God, as it's said. And japa is one way to do it. And also homework, find a mantra or japa that you repeat regularly and just starts going in the back of your mind. You can maybe even see as your game how quickly you can get that going when you wake up in the morning. And just start making this a game in your life. There was a Christian saint that Swamiji had great respect for. I think he heard him speaking one time on the radio, and he thought, this man is a saint. And he would practice the presence of God. He wrote a book about practicing the presence of God, where just every moment he would share every thought with God. That was his goal. It's hard. You'll see. It's not easy. Swamiji, in some lectures in his recent years, said, try to just spend 3 minutes a day thinking of God, is what he said, but start to make it more and more. Start connecting those 3 minutes more and more throughout the day. And this man, he would just share every thought with God. If he was walking, he would walk with Christ or with God. And there's someone at Ananda village, her parents knew this man because they were also missionaries. And they were at a event or a conference that this Frank Laubach man was at. And he was asked to lead the prayer before a meal, I think it was. And the parents said it was really quite striking what this guy did, because he didn't compose himself and straighten his shirt, get centered and put his hands up and lead a prayer the way that we tend to do those things. He just instantly started talking. And the parents said it was almost like they walked in on the middle of a conversation that this man was already having. It was that unusual. It wasn't like he started the prayer. he was almost like they walked in on the middle of the prayer, because he was already talking to God at that moment when he was asked to lead the prayer. And so it can become that habituated and that strong of a habit. And so work with these habits. I think mental and feeling habits. Feeling, the way, the direction that our feeling goes is a habit. If emotion tends to go outward, it's just like I was driving that car up my chakras, up the spine, and I was kind of spacing out, and the energy was used to getting diverted at the heart chakra and going out, and I went to my old home, which was the home of emotion. This home wasn't emotional, but in this analogy, it's the heart energy going out emotionally. And again, it tends to happen when we're more passive. And so changing a habit, Master said changing a habit simply is repeating an action, a thought, an energy over and over and over again. And if you do it over and over again, it starts to create new grooves in the brain. And this is what we're trying to do when we're trying to change these habits of feeling, of thought, emotion, consciousness, all these things. Now, and this is what Yoganandaji said. He said, there is no possible excuse for not talking to him inwardly. No possible excuse. So this is real bhakti yoga, that you can practice anywhere, all the time. And the more you will practice, the nearer you will be. I find it helpful not just to do japa, but to really feel God's presence and have this more heart awareness of the Guru or God inside of myself. And I think japa is one way to do it, but it can also be mechanical, and you just don't, it's better than not doing it at all. But if you were doing japa to Divine Mother, let's say, imagine if you were a child and you were wanting your mother, and your mother was in front of you. Would you keep doing japa as you were standing in front of her? Or would you just start expressing your love, or just silently worshiping and adoring your mother? And so also at times try to develop just this worshipful awareness of Guru or God or Divine Mother in your heart as you're walking. I just find this very, very helpful practice when I'm just walking by myself, and find ways during the day to do something by yourself where you don't have to engage outwardly. It can be I find long drives by myself are amazingly blessed and joyful and God reminding, just because I'm inward. And yeah, you have to pay attention to the road and all that. You can't go into samadhi or anything while you're driving, but anytime you just go for a walk, rather than thinking in terms of worrying or what's happening today, what's this person did, just try to use those again, using the habit of when I walk, even just the 10 minutes I walk to the shop to buy something, vegetables or something, just use that, okay, Lord, I'm walking with you here. And sometimes I find it helpful to actually visualize the Guru or God walking with me, and believe it or not, I actually will hold my hand out sometimes as I'm walking, just to reinforce that sense and feeling that God is always walking with me. My part is to invite God to do it, or just reach out my hand, because God is always there. It's just, again, our awareness that's not there. And that's what we're trying to develop with this. The other attitude or tool is trying to see everything as coming from God. And that can be a hard one when tests come. And you'll see the great saints, they advise, when we've offered our lives to God, that God and the Guru take charge of our life. And everything that comes to us, it's not just bad karma. I don't like that word bad karma, because for a few reasons. One is, it's too much like the Western concept of sin. And so people say bad karma, I'm suffering because of bad karma. And basically people are saying I'm suffering because I'm a sinner. I made a mistake, I sinned, and now I'm being punished. And it's just completely the wrong concept of this whole idea of karma. And in fact, you'll find that very often, quote, bad karma can be the greatest blessing in our life if it pushes us towards God. And very often it does for the devotee. And so try to see everything as coming from God. There's a story of this South Indian saint, Swami Ramdas, who practiced this, and he saw Ram everywhere. He chanted Ram mantra. Everyone he saw was Ram. Even the bad was coming from Ram. And he described being in the train station. He was a wandering sadhu, and the station masters of some train stations beat the sadhus and drove them away because they didn't like them freeloading and getting free rides. And so he was in a train station, and this station master came with a big stick and started beating him. And in his notes, sort of his diary, Ram Das wrote, "And the Lord Ram came in the form of the station master and started blessing his disciple by hitting him with a stick." And then he said that he was in seclusion, and his only belongings were a begging bowl and a shawl and his spectacles. And he came back one day and they were all stolen. And he said, and this devotee came back to his cave, and while he was gone, the Lord came back and took away his belongings of the spectacles and the shawl and everything. And so just try to see this. And I mentioned this one time in the context of a talk at Ananda Village, that people sometimes get sentimental about what God gives us. And Swamiji, he sort of got irritated sometimes when people would say only the good things. Oh, Guru gave me this nice apartment. I was out driving and I was late, and Divine Mother opened up a parking space. And he said, yes, I mean, I laugh with everyone else because I've done it too. So it's not like it's a bad thing. But Swamiji was saying it all comes from God. They're not just here to make our lives easier. And sometimes they want to make our lives harder so that we turn back to them. And I said, how many times have we gone out and come back to our car and there was a parking ticket? And we said, oh, and I came back and Divine Mother gave me a parking ticket. I mean, we never say that. And I told this at Ananda Village one time at a satsang. And there was a friend from our Palo Alto community who was attending. And that week there was a voicemail on my phone. And he was calling and he was so excited. He said, Devarshi, I came back to my car today and Divine Mother gave me a parking ticket. And he was so excited not at the parking ticket, but that he could see the hand of Divine Mother in an experience like that for the first time. And so you'll find that if you see these things as coming from God, you also feel a great blessing in even bad karmas. And I think we more quickly learn the lesson that God is trying to teach us through those karmas when we see it as Divine Mother trying to help us. I had experience in this not very long ago, just maybe a month ago. I was driving, and again, I was by myself driving and just in a more thoughtful mood. And I came to a stoplight here in Pune, and the beggars were there, selling little trinkets and things. And I'm rarely sort of get emotionally touched by such situations, but there was one man there who it was a little heartrending for me for some reason. Maybe it was my mood or something, but it was a very older man who you could see he was both physically and mentally disabled. And because I was talking to Divine Mother, I said it mentally, but I shouted it mentally. I said, Mother, you're not taking care of your children. And I said it with a lot of feeling and irritation and frustration, because it was obvious that she wasn't taking care of this child. But then this answer came to me almost right away. And it wasn't like the voice of Divine Mother speaking to me. It was my own intuition. But I think she was guiding the voice of my own intuition, because it was a clear statement, instantaneous, and it wasn't just a thought. And the words that were said was, I give each one exactly what they need. And as I meditated on that statement, what they need, it wasn't what they deserved, the karma that they earned, it was what they need, and what they need to take the next step spiritually, to grow in freedom, to grow in self-offering. And the other part of that statement was, I give each one exactly what they need. Exactly, not kind of roughly what they need, but it was like she was saying, I pay deep attention to each individual soul. Each one is my child. I give each one exactly what they need to grow closer in God. And so if we can see negative experiences, so-called negative experiences, and just ask, what do I need? And don't make it so much a mental thing. Just, what attitude do I need? Maybe she's trying to help me develop strength and courage. But this tendency to think this way, I have found, has developed naturally from practicing more of this devotional presence. Now, I'll have a little bit of time for questions, but for Kriya Bandhs especially, try to make a focus, especially in these next couple of weeks, making Kriya more of a devotional practice. In the biography of Paramahansa Yogananda, Swami Kriyananda wrote, and this was after 60 years of practicing Kriya, he said, every Kriya I see now should be an act of devotional self-offering. Not some Kriyas, every single Kriya. And so make Kriya technique itself a devotional practice where when we offer the energy up the spine, it's just purely complete, heartfelt devotional offering of our entire being to God, up to the spiritual eye. And as Swamiji taught, when the energy comes down, feel that divine grace is descending. I think you may find, like me, that this really almost supercharges the practice of Kriya. And make this the main focus of your Kriya Yoga practice for the next month, maybe, just to see what happens. And hold nothing back. And just feel like you're offering your strengths, your weaknesses, just your entire being. It's as simple as that. It's not a mental concept that we're doing. It's just offering ourselves, I'm completely yours, Lord. And in fact, I think if we could offer ourselves to God, holding nothing back in this very moment, we would merge back into God. But we're always holding something back, or there's fear, or there's attachment, or there's desire, and we're not able to completely offer ourselves. And so make this almost a practice of learning how to offer ourselves back to God completely. And if we do this with every Kriya, you'll find that you go deeper and deeper into it as not just a practice, but an actual experience of much more easily offering ourselves back. So are there any questions about any of this? What if body is sick? And this is a great opportunity also. And we've all dealt with it. And I found that it was a great blessing in my life when my body was the sickest it's ever been. I think sometimes, Divine Mother brings us to our knees. And I had this experience, and I've shared this before, where I had this condition that I couldn't even sit up. It was extreme pain, and a type of pain that it's a condition of the nerve in the head that the common name is suicide disease. It's trigeminal neuralgia. And it just brings you to your knees. You can't meditate. You're nauseous. The pain is just strange, like an electrical shock in your face and your jaw. And all I could do was offer myself. And it was the last thing I did. Was first, okay, God, what do I do about this? And then fear and worry. My God, what I'm reading about this says that usually you have it for the rest of your life. And just all these thoughts. And then you think, okay, I'm a yogi. I'll do Hong Sau. That didn't work. I couldn't sit up because I was nauseous and just weak. And then I thought, okay, Swamiji said go to the center of the pain when you are at the dentist. I tried that. Didn't work. And nothing I tried could work. And finally, I just practiced complete surrender. And I just laid myself at the feet of Divine Mother and said, and I wasn't asking for healing at all. I just said, Divine Mother, I know I'm your child. Whatever I go through, I'm your child. I know this is coming from you. And I scolded her for being a mother that would treat her children that way, or at least not train this child on how to deal with such things and send me out into delusion and not give me proper training. And I did, but lovingly. I wasn't angry or anything. I said, I offer myself at your feet, and I love you with all my heart, with no thought of, oh, I'm in pain, oh, I'm suffering, I'm sick. That had gone completely away. And that's when my healing began, is that I started feeling great joy, even in that moment of complete surrender and self-offering. And I think it was also, the healing began because I think Divine Mother that's the lesson that she was trying to teach me, was complete surrender. Now, other times with sickness, I think the lesson is to work with healing practices, with willpower, with energy, with affirmation. But even there, give the results to God and offer yourself into divine light, because in the end, it's divine light that heals us. And Yoganandaji told the story of this man who had diabetes, who was given like 3 months or 6 months to live, and he thought, okay, these last few months I'm just going to meditate all the time. And he couldn't sit for more than a few minutes or 15 minutes at a time, but he kept trying, and eventually this light came to him and blessed him and healed him. And he said to God after that healing, he said, I was only praying for your light. I wasn't asking for your healing. And so offering ourselves into that light, in addition to everything that we can do, because I was also doing everything practical and medications and trying to figure out how I could solve this problem. So that's some ways to deal with sickness and health, and accept it as, yes, karma, but not punishment for our sins and bad eating and this and that, and just trying to say, okay, Divine Mother, what are you trying to tell me here? And give me the strength and the awareness to understand what it is. So, okay. Any other questions?
So, one of the tools was sharing the heart, like imagining us as the soul of all belong to one life,
Yeah.
to one light, and then feeling that soul in everybody around
Yeah.
us, embedded with yours.
Yeah.
So, two situations arise when we practice Advaita. One is that how do we protect ourselves from being vulnerable? Because if we are practicing Advaita, then sometimes it happens that we are taken advantage of.
Yep.
So that increases the vulnerability.
Yeah.
Second is that sometimes if I get to know, because if we are in the state of Advaita with everybody, you tend to know that somewhere the energy is little down with the opposite person.
Yeah.
And then you tend to refrain after a time and retract yourself.
Yeah.
So that again may project you as person who is, high-headed or
Yeah.
rude. So that is also.
Yeah.
But then of course I devote it to Guru like you handle.
Yeah.
But these are the two things that basically arrive when we are practicing.
Yeah. And a third thing that also happens, we're starting to be affected negatively by the other person's energies because we're open on that level. The question is, when you practice this feeling of oneness with all creation and all people, you start to be more open to their energies and vulnerable. And so there's tendencies of ways of trying to respond. And one is to try to retract from the person because you feel a negative energy and you just don't want to be touched by it. Another one is to be weakened and touched by it. I forget what the first one was that you mentioned.
Vulnerability was the first to be touched.
Yeah.
And second is
Okay.
the retraction.
Yeah.
And third is of course like the energy.
Yeah. So how do we avoid that? And the best answer that I've seen, and it's one thing that I forgot to mention here as a practice, which is, well, two things. One is as we develop a stronger magnetism of the heart in a very strong divine way, our aura tends to be really strong, and we tend not to be shaken and influenced by negative emotions and energies of people because we're stronger in ourselves. We tend to be just the opposite. We tend to be the one who changes them through our magnetism and energy. But the other way to approach it is to think with all these practices in terms of giving, because very often when we're in negative worldly influences, we think in terms of protection and protecting our heart and, covering it, and it just makes us smaller. And so praying for people consciously and blessing them and sending them energy. One is it does help to change them, but two, it makes us more strongly magnetic, so we're not as influenced and touched. And three, I think it almost creates a force field around us of divine light and protection, so that's really the way that we're protected, rather than trying to, in a contractive, passive way, try to protect ourselves. But it is a good practice to try to feel one's oneness with all people, with all of creation. It's very expansive. But giving is the greatest way to expansion, I think. And with all the practices that I was talking about, see it in terms of giving, rather than, with practicing japa, rather than doing it for the purpose of Divine Mother, when are you ever going to come to me? And it's me, 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 me. And just think in terms of just giving your love to Divine Mother without any thought of self, just like a child. And you'll see that the magnetic child, and I think I talked about this last week, is the one who gives love to the mother, is much more quickly inclined to be picked up. And, a mother is impartial and picks all children up equally, and maybe more so the one that's having a hard time. But, Master talked about the love that we have for God. He described it in Autobiography of a Yogi as magnetic ardor, and I mentioned this last week. And when we develop this strong, passionate desire and love for God, it has the magnetism to draw divine response. And that magnetic desire is also part of giving. And I've told this story once or twice before of this woman who was visiting Ananda village. And she was from Brazil, and she was going back to Brazil. And she was praying to Master, what do I do when I go back? I want to be able to serve. I want to feel your presence. And she was staying just in a tent at our retreat in California. And Yogananda came, I don't know if he came into her tent or outside of her tent, but he appeared before her to answer her prayer. And his answer was, he didn't get into an explanation, do this, do that, and this other thing, and give her a whole plan of action. He just said one word. And that one word was give. And she went back and she started giving to people in whatever way she could. And when you give energy, give love, give seva, give support, it just starts to create a magnetism and energy that just starts changing us and starts expanding our consciousness. This is what devotional self-offering that Swamiji described, the way we should practice Kriya, is simply giving. It's a giving of ourself up the spine, offering the heart's energy up to God. And so think in terms of giving, especially as a tool, rather than just being dispassionate and sort of uninvolved. So, and it's a bumpy road, because our giving sometimes is misinterpreted and gets in trouble. But I saw Swami Kriyanandaji. He gave even when people were persecuting him and attacking him, and he never stopped giving. And that in the end, that's the way out, even though it seems sometimes a little bit of a bumpy road. You have a question?
You're saying that it's not about years, it's about minute to minute.
Yeah.
So, as small as the practice of smiling at each other.
Yeah.
Can that...
Absolutely. Smiling at people is just one of the greatest gifts that you can give them. It really is. As an offering, it really, truly is. And especially when it's coming from inside and just expressing and seeing them as a child of God and just consciously sending energy. And yeah, it's just, I think one of the greatest gifts that you can possibly give people is a sincere smile for no reason, just as a gift. So think that's a beautiful way of thinking of it, is, again, in terms of giving God to others as a daily practice. So yeah, thanks. Any other questions? Nope. Yeah.
I'll be honest, I often think about these questions beforehand. But see, sometimes you come to the spiritual environment or an ashram after having difficult time outside in the world. We don't know the laws and such. And we say, okay, finally we'll get some peace, or we'll work on ourselves.
Yeah.
And maybe tests won't come so much. Or we have this question, if you take it more esoterically, by working, am I creating more karma, or am I burning karma? Because life can get tougher, as you said, if Master sends difficult tests.
Yeah.
How do you gauge, are you going in the right direction?
Oh, how do we gauge if we're going in the right direction? We go to a spiritual environment, and the tests don't end in the spiritual environment. And how do we gauge if we're going in the right direction in all these efforts that we make? And I think one of the best ways, and Swamiji talks about this with signs of spiritual progress, one of the best ways is, are we getting gradually more and more of an inner freedom? Are we starting to become more selfless and generous? Are we starting to be more compassionate? Are we especially starting to have more and more of a desire for God? Now, that said, it's not like a straight line of progress that we have. It's more like 2 steps forward and 1 step back, because we stumble and go backwards sometimes. And when we're going backwards, we start thinking, oh God, I'm going backwards. I thought I was making the right effort and I was going forward, and all of a sudden it seems like I'm going backwards. And I think sometimes it's more for devotees who are sincere, it seems like we're going backwards. Sometimes it's also that just for the first time, there's a karma or a vritti or a desire or a flaw that's been deeply hidden. And by putting out the right energy, practicing kriya, it suddenly pops to the surface. And all of a sudden we see this like, oh my God, I didn't know I had that. And we think, geez, am I going backwards? And just, but really, Swami Kriyananda said when we see a flaw or a shortcoming in ourselves suddenly come up, rather than feeling bad or guilty, he said, clap your hands and just be really joyful, because this thing has always been there. It's been pulling energy to it. And now that it's come to the surface, now we can finally get rid of it. And in fact, when it comes to the surface, that's usually a sign that it's working its way out, like a splinter coming out of your finger. It's finally working its way out of the skin, and it's on its way out the door at that point. And maybe just needs a little bit of an extra nudge from us to work on it and push it. And I would not get too analytical about whether we're going forward or backwards. And I guess it's nishkam karma in a way of just work on putting out the right kind of effort, the best that we can with all these things that we've been talking about and others, and just trust that we're making progress. And I think God will tell us every once in a while, either you're not making progress in the right way, or now it's time for you to work on this. And so this, quote, bad karma will come and help us understand, okay, thank you, Divine Mother, for revealing this to me, and start putting out energy in that way. But I tend to be a simpleton in certain ways, which I tend not to get overly analytical about these kinds of things, and just try to keep it simple and think in terms of direction. And not the direction that I seem to be going, but the direction that my heart and my will and my energies are going. And I think you'll find, I think yogis sometimes get a little bit too down on themselves, because one, we're trying to achieve perfection. And any time that we're short of perfection, we think, boy, you can either think I haven't yet made it or I failed. And every meditation, I mean, you could almost say that every time we meditate, unless we reach samadhi and divine union, we failed, because that's why we're trying to meditate, and that's the goal. And so, yeah, there's a tendency sometimes of trying so many times, months, years, and not making it all the way there, that, yeah, sometimes the thought of failure can come in, and thinking that we're going backwards or we're stuck. But in fact, I think as Krishna said, any spiritual effort that we put out never goes for naught. It always produces some result. And our part then is simply just keep finding ways to put out spiritual effort, whatever way that we can do. And again, even if we're brought to our knees with illness or emotion or other karmas, just think, okay, what can I do? Even if it's just offering yourself back to God and saying, boy, I just cannot deal with this in the right way, but I offer myself to you, Lord. You're going to have to really help me here. And so I think it's just probably working more on our practices and see it again as a direction, a long-term direction, rather than a short-term direction, because we'll trip and stumble, and sometimes it'll seem like we're going backwards, when in fact we aren't, honestly, I think. So we tend to be a little too harsh on ourselves sometimes as yogis, because again, we're aiming high in this lifetime. Everyone in this room is aiming for moksha, I think. And so whenever we fall short of it, which is, every day for the last however many years, there's a tendency to maybe get down on ourselves a little bit. So just keep pushing in that direction, and you get there. This is how you get there, is by being persistent day by day, not complicating it, and just moving forward day by day, week by week. And I've seen this. I can say without exception, at the end of this lifetime, the Ananda yogis who have done this for their whole life, at the end they've made extraordinary progress. And I've also seen without exception that at the end, whether a couple of weeks before the end of their life or at the last moment, God finally took off all the pressure and just allowed them to see who they really were and what they had done in this life and the freedom that they had. And so I think for all of us who are striving for the highest, God does put I don't know if you could call it pressure, but is pushing us very hard to go and find complete freedom rather than just a little bit of happiness or a little bit of joy. So,
I was thinking if we could end with a 1 minute meditation, silence, and then a prayer.
okay.
I have
Okay.
a very small question. Many times I feel that japa becomes absent-minded.
It can. Yeah. But
It is going on, but our attention is not at all on God.
But that's not a reason to stop doing it. Eventually it does become more conscious. And maybe do a different mantra as a way of doing it more consciously. Or more importantly, it's not what we're saying, it's where our feeling is. And so doing a mantra, even not doing a mantra, but having an awareness of God or Guru and just feeling their presence is actually better than doing japa mechanically.
That's what I feel, that attention is not at all God and
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
don't know who is going on.
Oh, it has a power by itself, even when it's going on by itself. So that shouldn't be an excuse to stop doing it. Just keep doing it. So, okay, let's meditate for a minute. And let's pray to God, Divine Mother, the Guru. Offer ourselves up from the heart center to the spiritual eye. And with the understanding that the real change that happens is how they change us. It's not how we change ourselves. So offer ourselves into that light and just pray, Divine Mother, Guru, change me, change me, change me. Let's meditate like that for a moment. Om.